All right, so we're going to respond to some of John Lennox's thoughts on sort of the philosophy of religion type stuff as they discussed in Stephen Bartlett's podcast. So let's take a look.
And so I find myself sat on the fence. I would love you to convince me. I mean, it's not your responsibility to do so, but where does that journey of believing begin for someone like me? Because, people say the Bible, and I go, well, it's kind of like what you said about the computers. It's like, if you're using something to justify the same thing is true,
Yes.
then that circular reasoning I find to be incomplete, because I could write on this piece of paper, Stephen Bartlett is a lizard,
Yes.
and this piece of paper is true. And then you then use that same piece of paper to justify the validity of that same piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I
I
go, well,
got
that's
that.
not solid reasoning.
No.
Okay, so this is a great analogy to start off. I think the point he's making is spot on. Some images people like to use are if you were to take an extension cord and kind of plug it back into itself and, imagine that you can get power from that just by plugging it into itself. Yeah, definitely doesn't make sense. And so I think John Lennox's response here is going to be really important and telling in terms of this whole idea of where do we get our truth from.
But you see, I could say, Stephen Bartlett, there's a red Ferrari parked in the street outside,
Yeah.
and it's yours if you want to take it. We could sit and discuss it for 1,000 years. You would never know whether I was true or not unless you went and looked. And it seems to me the word skeptic is a very interesting one. I regard myself.
So before he goes on, the whole thing with going and looking to see if there's a Ferrari parked in the parking lot, it's not really helpful because you can do that. Like, you can physically go and check and use your eyes and verify, is there something out there that you're telling me? And that is totally different than this whole issue of questioning whether or not God exists. It's completely separate because the first thing we can actually physically verify with certainty, and this thing is categorically different. We cannot verify that, certainly not on any level of certainty. And so that is precisely the problem and the question. So that's not really a helpful analogy, unfortunately.
As a skeptic, but in Greek, skeptai means to look at something from a distance. Now, if you are ever going to get to know a person, you've got to begin to give up your distance. You will know that from everyday life. And it seems to me one of the things to try to begin to grasp is God is not a proposition or a philosophy or even a religion. God is a person. And as a person, he has entered our world, however incredible that may seem. Although this is the irony of the Harari position, if I might just say it on the side. People come to me, as they've done, with their transhumanist agenda and say, we're going to solve the problem of death and we're going to increase human happiness. And I look at them and I smile and I say, you're too late. And they say, what? We haven't got there yet. I said, you're too late. What do you mean we're too late? Well, I said, the problem of physical death was solved when God raised Christ from the dead 20 centuries ago. And as for human happiness and uploading us into eternity, I'm waiting for the biggest uploading that's ever going to happen in history when Christ returns and raises me from the dead, because that is precisely what he promises. And it's most interesting watching people. And I say, isn't it fascinating that your transhumanism consists in humans reaching out to become little gods, whereas Christianity is the exact opposite. It talks about a God who became human so that he could give us life and give us a new relationship with him. What really completes the circle for me is that my relationship with God is a relationship which is based on the solution to the really hard problem. And that is the problem that I, by nature, have not always done good. And by my own standards, I've failed. Now, all this talk of transhumanism, AI, and everything else, what it's trying to do is to build paradise, utopia, without facing the problem of the damage that humans have caused to themselves and one another. They will not face the sin problem. Christianity, to me, doesn't compete with anything else, because Christ offers me something nobody else offers me. Nobody else offers me peace. The peace of knowing that I have a friend and a companion to whom I can talk all the time. That's been so meaningful in my life, as I spell out in detail my autobiography. And the peace of having been given a new life that will not end when I die. I'm 82 now. I'm probably more than twice as old as you are. As I look towards the future, I have in my heart a certainty. Not because I've merited it, the exact opposite, because I couldn't merit it, but because Christ has done something for me through the cross and the resurrection. That may sound all mumbo jumbo at the moment, but has done something that enables me to have a relationship that is secure, that floods over the whole of life, and has made my life what it is for the last 70 years, more or less.
So none of this is really helpful. He's at this point just kind of rambling about his own beliefs. You might say it's kind of a nice or even beautiful articulation of what Christianity is on some level, but it doesn't really help answer the question, how do we know that it's true? So they'll go on from here.
There's this other part of my brain which will naturally interrogate whether it's real or it's true.
You're absolutely right. Why am I sitting in front of you talking about this stuff? Because I've interrogated myself about it and its truth for over 70 years. I've made myself totally vulnerable. That's why I got into all the debates with New Atheists and all the rest of it, because I want to be sure. But it won't come about by pressing a button. It will come about if you're open enough to say, God, I'm open. Reveal yourself to me, and I'm prepared to take the steps that I feel are leading me onto solid ground. I do not believe that this is a process of taking a leap into the dark, but it's making a commitment on the basis of what you know already and taking a step further forward. And the interesting thing about this is the trust that's at the heart of everything. I trust my wife. I've been married to her for 58 years this year. It's evidence-based trust. I don't trust her for no reason. And the same is true of my friends, as would be the case with you. Evidence-based trust in science and in Christian things. I don't regard myself as religious particularly. And the reason is this, and it's an important reason. Most religions prescribe a moral way that you try to follow, and you've teachers, gurus, imams, all the rest, priests, to keep you on the way, and then you come to a judgment at the end, and I usually draw a scale of justice, and if your good deeds tip over the bad deeds, then you get into whatever it is, heaven, nirvana, all the rest of that's religion. It's not Christianity, though many people think it is, because if you ask them, are you a Christian? They say, well, I do my best and I hope that God will be kind. That isn't Christianity. It's the exact opposite of Christianity. That's a merit-based religion. And you see, the iron...
So again, this isn't really addressing the point. It's also kind of an oversimplification of other religions and really kind of misrepresenting them by making Christianity seem like it's morally superior in some sense. Christianity is a religion just like any other, and the positive benefits of other religions are pretty much the same as with Christianity. The idea that all other religions are kind of merit-based and that's where salvation comes in, like that's just, again, it's an oversimplification of all different systems, so that's a whole other conversation. But really the point is that this isn't really addressing the question. It's not really a sufficient response.
The of all this is that we would never, or at least I don't know, some people might, but in a human relationship, we don't base our affection and relationship with someone on the basis of their merit. I have a little analogy I use that sometimes tickles people's minds. I say that I met a beautiful girl on my second day at Cambridge. I'd been warned she might be there, and she was, sitting in church. And I decided that I'd like to marry her, so I bought the most expensive cookery book I could. And I came and I handed it to her, and she said, "What's that?" Well, I said, we have an interesting tradition in our family, you see. And if anybody gets married, they give the potential bride a cookbook. Why? Well, look at page 152. Here's the laws for making an apple cake, and I like apple cake. So law 1222, take so much flour, sugar. Now I said, it's going to be like, if you keep those rules for the next, let's be generous, 40 years or so, I will accept you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Now, when I say that to an audience, they rock about with laughter, but it's exactly the way many of them have been taught to think about God. Keep the rules as best as you can and hope that God is generous. When actually, I did no such thing. I've given my wife several cookbooks, but they're not the basis of the relationship. And because the relationship is based on acceptance that comes at the start of the common journey, it sets her free to live and do other things that she wants to do. And I have noticed often that once people begin to realize that, they're beginning to understand a basic concept, which is grace, that God does everything. And if we trust him, he it is that gives us the certainty. So it's not arrogance to accept it from him. It's arrogance actually to reject and say, oh, no, I'll go my own way and I'll try my best. And the heart of the Christian message, which I believe is there, is that the trust is based on what someone else has done, what Christ has done, not what I have done. And that's what's given me the power. And as I said earlier, completed the circle and enabled me to live.
That was a really beautiful description and definition of what the Christian faith is about. It still leaves me with a question about whether it's true. And this is the sort of...
Yeah, exactly what I was saying. This is kind of just rambling about what he believes. This isn't answering the question. The question is, how can we know that it's true? How is there some level of certainty that God exists, etc.? So hopefully he responds better to this.
Central question that I need to find my way over.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely.
And this is, I find myself often, I've sat with a few like Christian apologists and asked them similar questions about, like, how do I know if it's true? And I guess so far I've got, if there's a red Ferrari outside, you'd have to go outside and see for yourself. That's the only way you're going to know. But how do you know that this thing you've committed yourself to and you've believed and, talked about for 70 years of your life is true? And could it be the case that it's not true?
Okay, let's handle that. That's a hugely important question. I have two approaches to this, which I call, roughly speaking, objective and subjective. And it depends entirely where someone's coming from. They may start very far back and say, look, we read about this chap Jesus, how do we know he ever existed? Well, then you go to the ancient historians and you find that most of them, whether they're atheists or not, believe that he existed and so on.
I accept that he existed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a good start. Some of the disciples, when Jesus rose from the dead, they just didn't believe the story. Ridiculous. And there's a famous story of Thomas, who said to the others, he said, unless I see the marks in his hands and so on, I won't believe. And then Jesus stood among them. And he didn't make fun of Thomas's objective. He said, Thomas, come and have a look. You never know what swimming is until you get into the water. Isn't that true?
It is true.
Okay, so here's the problem with that idea. You can't learn to swim until you get into the water. That's a fair point on a certain level. The problem is it just doesn't help. It doesn't work for this because, again, the same thing with going out and seeing if there's a Ferrari in the parking lot. There is something that we don't have access to, is the difference. We don't have access to this possible reality that God exists. At least not if not something that we can go out and seek and find intentionally. If it is true, maybe it has to be revealed to us. We can't just decide to go and see if it's there and find it. That's just not how it works, clearly, or else we would all know the answers. So I think there's definitely something more to it that either he's not saying or he just doesn't have an answer to, but let's see what he says next.
All I can say is that step by step, keep asking your questions. Absolutely. I don't believe that God will ever ask us to take a step with which we should be uncomfortable. I just don't believe that.
Could you be wrong that Christianity... So could it be the case that Christianity was about a real guy called Jesus, based on a real guy called Jesus, but the stories told, there was decades passed between the things that happened and people...
Not so much as you'd think, actually.
What, for 4 decades for the first time?
When you say to me, could you be wrong? My academic mind says theoretically yes, but practically no. Could I be wrong? It would be like asking me, John, you've been married to Sally for 58 years. Could you be wrong that she loves you? Well, theoretically, yes. But actually, the evidence all points in the other direction. And that's what I would say that I have built up in my life. And I'd love you to ask me that question when you've read that autobiography.
Why would you think it would reach?
Because I think what I relate there is enough evidence for someone outside who's skeptical to say there may well be something in that. But in the end, you won't know until you step into the water.
Okay, so there are a couple problems with this. Seems to be his central premise that, and it's fair, I appreciate that he's not trying to say that there is some sort of logical concept that can prove that God exists or something like that. I think that it's better to appeal to the experience of a person. I think that absolutely makes sense, and I agree with that our experience is really the only thing that can convince us, make anybody certain of something like the existence of God or whatever. The problem with what he's saying here is he's saying we need to step out, we need to make the connection to this relationship, we need to take the leap or whatever. It's a faith thing, right? There are a few issues with this. The first is, first of all, what Bartlett said a minute ago, which is that you can't simply choose to believe something. That's the first part. I don't think that's necessarily what Lennox is saying. It sounds like he's saying if you submit yourself to this reality, then it will become apparent to you and God will reveal things to you. The issues with this are, one, of course, if I submit myself to a particular reality, it's going to become true to me. And as soon as I do that, I'm going to realize the reality and the truth of it. So if I said, you know what, I am tired of being on the fence about Bigfoot, I am choosing to believe that Bigfoot is real, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to determine if that's true. And of course, if I am submitting to that reality, then that is what is going to seem real to me because I have convinced myself of it, and because of everything that I see is going to appear like evidence that Bigfoot is real and that reality is true. That's something that we can do for ourselves. We can kind of convince ourselves of something. We can sort of deceive ourselves into believing a particular thing. So, yeah, that's kind of obvious on any belief system. If I wanted to believe X, Y, or Z, then submitting to that reality is going to make me believe it more and see the evidence of it. But the other problem with this is this doesn't seem to be the case even on his belief system, because you have, for example, the Apostle Paul. Supposedly, if this experience that Paul had in seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus, he wasn't seeking it. He was, it was revealed to him in some way, even against his will, even against what it is that he actually truly believed. And this seems to be, apparently, what a lot of people experience. There are a variety of believers who believed the opposite, who didn't believe in God, and they had some sort of mystical experience that convinced them otherwise. So if that's true, it seems like this idea that you need to submit yourself to the truth in order for it to be revealed to you isn't actually true. It seems like it arbitrarily, maybe not arbitrarily, but it comes to certain people even though they don't want it. But then there's the other aspect of there are people who, like myself, did genuinely affirm it and believe it, and over time, because of whatever it was, deconstruction or investigating their faith, their beliefs more, they came to lose that belief and believe something different. So those are a couple of the reasons. There are lots of people who have had the same experience as I have, who went from belief away from it. So that this all just kind of points away from what he's saying about you need to submit yourself to this reality in order for it to be sort of become revealed to you more and more. It doesn't seem to be true really on any level for all of these different reasons.
And then you find that Christ is there to catch you.
And what did you find in the water when you stepped into the water?
Well, I was very young. You see, my parents taught me quite clearly that I wasn't born a Christian.
This is super duper important. Now, this isn't just Lennox's story. It's a similar story to William Lane Craig, various other apologists. The problem here is that they didn't have enough life experience to make a change in their beliefs. So a young person, maybe a person who is a child or in their preteens or even teens, they're not developed, they haven't had enough life experiences to say, I have considered X, I have considered Y, and because of all of it, I have decided that X or Y or Z is true, right? He's saying when he was young, he was taught something and he committed himself to it, and so he's spent the rest of his life, 70 years of his adult life, pretty much all of his adult life, believing it and investigating it to a certain extent. Maybe he was open to having his mind changed, but he hasn't changed his mind about it since he was young, since he was raised to believe these things. And it's significant that there are a lot of people, again, like myself, who were raised to believe these things, and because they investigated it, they came to believe something different. That is a really significant aspect of this whole question.
You become a Christian by trusting Christ. That's to have somebody born or made a Christian by some ceremony is absurd to my mind. And so, in my simple way, I responded as a child. I didn't have any great feelings or anything else. But what happened to me as I grew, and especially as I went to university in Cambridge, and I decided, look, I really believe this stuff is true. I'm going to stand for it. And it was when I began to stand and share with others that a great deal of the underpinning came in and the certainty came. Cumulatively, not all a big... I've never had these big flashes of anything, but I have had several experiences of what I can only put down to direct divine guidance, and I record them in the book.
So there it is right there. He said it. He was committed to it already. And so then from that point on, anything that he experienced, he basically attributed to this belief system that he had adopted. So there it is.
And then I went into the whole New Atheist movement with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and that little phase of my life. But one of the stats that used to get me when I went through that New Atheist movement was that globally, 91% of adults simply adopt and keep the religion they were raised in. And if a person is born into a Hindu or Muslim household, there is a 99% statistical probability they will remain in that faith. Only 1% switch out. And then the argument, I think it came from Dawkins or someone else, was that is it fair that there's this birth lottery determining who ends up believing what, or theoretically getting into hell or heaven?
Yes.
Because if I was born in, I don't know, Afghanistan, the probability says I'd probably be Muslim.
Yeah, well, I take that, absolutely.
So God gave you an advantage in this context because he allowed you to be born he's in his all-knowing, understanding way put you to be born in a place where you were likely
That's
to be
right.
Christian.
And it sounds to me as if he gave the same advantage to you. So the question is, what do we do with that privilege?
Okay. I think there's a major issue with what his response here. First of all, he doesn't respond to it. He doesn't answer the question. He sidesteps it and he makes a cute comment and moves on to something different here. The point is that it seems to contradict the idea that God exists, or specifically that Christianity is true, because there are different collections of belief systems in different locations around the world. And so it seems like if God did exist and God did reveal God's self to the world, there would be at least sort of an even distribution globally. So why would God provide this sort of advantage to people in a particular location or in the West specifically? That's the problem. It seems like it's more likely that everybody around the world kind of develops their own religious system that probably isn't true. Then a real God would only reveal God's self, at least particularly to this particular global. He responds on the operating assumption that this God does exist, specifically his God does exist, and we just kind of have to accept that fact, and we have to figure out why it is that that's the case. That's a pretty common response, but it doesn't answer the question about how we can know if God is real, if there is truth in these things that he is saying. It only says, I assume it's real, I believe it's true, therefore there has to be some answer to this weird question, and I don't know what it is. And that's all that's going on. There's not an actual answer to whether or not this is something that we can believe.
To your question, it's a question I ask often.
Because God could correct this.
Well, this is just the point. And we have had these arguments and debates. A good God and an all-powerful God would, could, should, all this kind of stuff. And we never get a satisfactory answer to that. So I've come up with another problem, possibly because I'm a mathematician, and when we've hammered at one problem for centuries, we usually stop and try another one.
Okay, so he's evading the question and asking a whole different one. That's not helpful.
Problem is just as hard, but I think it gets me a bit further, and it's this. Every worldview must face a mixed picture. I call it beauty and barbed wire, or beauty and bombs. That's the world. It's mixed, and if you don't accept that, you're not in touch with reality. Now, here's my question. Is there anywhere evidence enough to trust God with that situation? That's a hard question.
And by that you mean the situation of the sort of geographical distribution of belief?
Yes, we'll never understand it or solve it.
But do we trust God?
Do we trust God ultimately to be absolutely fair? Because if God isn't fair in the end, he knows what everybody thinks, I believe. And we'll be surprised, maybe, at what he does, because he can measure how much people know. My responsibility is twofold. One, to respond to the evidence I've had, and then Christ tells me to go and share it. And that's
He's not answering this question. He's just saying we're basing our belief on the assumption. Essentially, this is what's happening. Basing his belief on an assumption that it is true, choosing to believe that it is true, and in response to that, you kind of have to sort of imagine there is a response that is mysterious to us, that God has some reason for all of it, but there's nothing that actually responds to the question, how can we know that the belief system is true? It starts with the assumption that the belief system is true and builds off of that, saying we can't really know God's will in these other scenarios, but that's the problem, is the foundational understanding of why we believe what we believe. There's just not a sufficient response to this.
I think, yeah, so when I think about what I understand of the Bible, there's a particular part of the Bible that talks about the only way into heaven is through Jesus. And from that I inferred that the only way to get into this great place that everybody wants to go to is by believing
But does
in
everybody
Christianity.
want to go to it? I'm not sure that they do. I have met many people who, when they hear what Christ offers, they reject it. But
Okay, again, just sidestepping the actual question, going on to a whole other concept. The problem here is that going on to a whole other concept, he's kind of choosing the responses that he wants to give, but the point is the question is asking how a legitimate God that exists could create a system where this is the way that it is on the Christian view. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Talking about totally other things and doesn't provide a sufficient response to the actual foundational philosophical question of God's nature and the reason why God would create a system in such a way. It's contradictory, logically contradictory for us, the supposed nature of this God that Christians claim to believe in. So let's see.
that's
Yeah.
another point.
So if we talk about this distribution,
Yes.
sort of birthright distribution of what you believe, and then those that believe this one particular thing are going to get into this heaven, it feels unfair. Or this idea that only those that believe get in is wrong. Or God is not as nice as we thought, and he's playing a bit of a cruel
Well,
game.
there's a fair bit going for your logic there.
Like I said, I don't have perfect answers either way, so that's why the word agnostic seems to be perfectly apt. The other real question that I had that really stumped me when I was 18 years old was this point about omniscience.
Yes.
It's the oldest question in the sort of atheist religious battle, which is, if God is all-knowing, he knew exactly which individuals would reject
Yes.
him and suffer and go to hell before he even created them.
Yeah. That's determinism.
So how is creating a soul that you know is doomed an act of love?
Well, it isn't. I don't go for that determinism. In fact, I've written a book that thick about it.
I think it was actually Ricky Gervais tell
Yes.
the story of the baby being born in, let's say it's Africa or somewhere else, or India or wherever it might be, the UK, who is born with a parasite eating its eyeball out from the
Yeah,
inside.
I know this. Yeah.
And I remember hearing that when I was 18
Yeah, terrible.
and thinking, okay, so if God's all-knowing, he knew that that baby was going to have its eye eaten out by a parasite before the baby was born, but allowed the baby to be born anyway. And with my moral compass, I would have intervened. And if he's omnipotent, all-powerful, he could have intervened. So how do you, where is the flaw in that question? Is there a flaw? Is there a misunderstanding?
I think there can be a misunderstanding, but it's a very understandable one, because I feel exactly the weight of that as well. My question that I set out a few minutes ago, is there any evidence anywhere that God, you can trust God with it? And the major piece of evidence, to my mind, is the cross of Christ. And if Christ really is God, whom he claimed to be, this is God's suffering. And why is God suffering? Well, it certainly tells me that he hasn't remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Now, that's not an answer. There are no simplistic answers here. But you see,
He keeps saying he's not giving an answer, and he's not. It's kind of frustrating. So I think he just keeps speaking to this idea that there are, there are some ways in which the Christian response to these questions is beautiful, let's say, but it doesn't make sense. This is the problem, because God would not have to suffer with God's creation if God had full control over this creation and loved it so much that God wouldn't want people to suffer in these ways. This is the question that Bartlett is asking, and this is a very basic question of evil and suffering, and there's not a great response to this. Nobody, no Christian apologist has a perfect response, and that's why Lennox here kind of, let's say, equivocates a bit. But the point of the question is, if there is this omnipotent God, and that's what Bartlett is leading with, this question about God's omnipotence, it doesn't make sense to say that God is omnipotent and perfectly loving, but yet there's still evil in this world. This is where the model of God matters the most. So this doesn't necessarily say that God does not exist or cannot exist, but the point is we have to have a good concept of what God's nature is. And so this is where, for example, I think open theism or process theism provides a better response than classical theism or something like Molinism. God wouldn't be able to know about these things happening in the future, because if God did know about these things happening in the future, it would be better for God to either not create human beings or to prevent this suffering in some way. So this isn't really ultimately a knockdown argument against God's existence. However, Lennox isn't even going that far as to making statements about God's nature. He's just kind of sidestepping the question and talking about something totally different.
But suppose God can compensate that child because he has the power to raise from the dead as he did with Jesus. That changes everything for me. The universe without a resurrection. I don't know whether you've ever watched my debate, the first one with Richard Dawkins.
I suspect I have.
The
I watched
very last bit of it, we were suddenly told we'd only 2 minutes to wrap up instead of 9 each. And I said something about the resurrection. And I'll never forget what Richard said. It was something like this: we've had a great discussion about big ideas and so on. And now we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. How petty, how parochial, how unworthy of the universe. And I remember thinking, if Jesus rose from the dead, it's the biggest thing that's ever happened, because it may open the way to understanding that there is life after death. And you see, C.S. Lewis has helped me a lot. I used to listen to him. I'm that old. He has helped me a lot in this idea of a sense in which there's more than one world. And we're so conditioned to thinking that this world is the only one there is. But if there is another world, and there is a loving God, then I suspect, I can't prove this to you, but when we one day see and enter that world and see what God has done with the kind of child you mentioned, we'll have no more questions.
So you think he's compensated that child?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so here's the major problem with this idea that God is compensating this child who suffers in this way. It's not necessary, and there's no compensation that actually is sufficient. Imagine that suffering is necessary for whatever great benefit or blessing comes with eternity. If we imagine that that is the case, then maybe that is a sufficient response to say, okay, our suffering has a purpose. Ultimately, we are going to have this great benefit, this great edification that comes from it. But it doesn't matter if it's the greatest possible blessing, if the blessing is 1,000,000,000 times greater, 1,000,000,000,000,000 times greater than the suffering that a person endured. Even if that's the case, the suffering wasn't necessary. Why was it that if God is omnipotent, if God did have the capacity, the ability to prevent that suffering from happening, if God could create a world in which the suffering was not a necessary aspect of the conclusion of this great blessing, then why in the world would it be the way that it is? So this goes back to the question of God's nature. It seems like process theology or open theism would have to be the best response to these things, because if God was perfectly capable and perfectly loving to prevent such suffering, then there's no reason for God to have created a world with this suffering, even if it has such a great blessing in response to all of it. So that's a question of God's nature. That's sort of a separate question about whether or not God exists. But it does seem like there is a sense in which Lennox is just responding to this question by assuming God's existence and not really addressing the question of how could it be possible that this perfectly good and perfectly powerful God is creating a world in such a way.
Is it important that I believe in God? Like, if I live a good life, I'm kind to people and I do my best.
But you see, that's exactly the point I was making. That people think that living a good life and being kind to people is what God is interested in. When God is prepared for us a relationship with himself through Christ that deals with the forgiveness of sins that we all need. Forgive me using the hackneyed phrase, but that's it. And will give us a new life and a power to live, a new power.
I think Bartlett's point here, though, is why isn't that enough? So if it is indeed true that God isn't going to hold it against people for not knowing something, you know, if God is a perfectly loving being who wants the most people to be saved and live with God forever, why is it that we have this idea that for people that don't believe it or don't know about it, or maybe they know and they just aren't sure if they believe it, and they do live a good life, they live the best life that they possibly can, why isn't that enough? That is the point that Bartlett is asking about, and I think this is a valid point. I don't think that if such a God actually did exist, and there were people that even knew about Jesus, even knew about this idea of the Christian God, and yet they weren't sure if they believed it, but they did their best to live a good life, that would not preclude them from this kingdom of heaven or whatever. Because if God wants them to be with God, then their lack of certainty about such things isn't going to prevent them from being included. I think that Lennox isn't really addressing this point sufficiently. I think that the question is valid, and this is part of the problem that many people have with Christianity, is that Christians tend to draw this line in the sand and say, if you don't either have these certain beliefs, or if you just don't have this relationship, whatever, then that prevents you from having the salvation that Christians claim to have. And that just doesn't make any sense. Like, there are people in the world who are absolutely doing their best, who are absolutely good people on the basis of our moral standard as human beings, and theoretically that should at the very least be enough.
But we don't have the power to live as we should. If we compare ourselves to the Sermon on the Mount for a week, we'll soon realize that we're lacking. And
Sure, but it's the difference between being perfect versus doing your best and just generally having a mode of being a good person and living with good ethics and morals in your life. Doing more positive than negative.
Statistically the case that the more hopeless your life becomes, the higher the probability you have of turning to a religion. And also, if you're having a crisis of meaning in your life for whatever reason, I looked at some of the data and it does show that
that's absolutely right, and that's what you'd expect if it's true, at least to a certain extent. It gives people something outside themselves. But it's simple psychology, I would have thought.
Simple psychology.
But it doesn't prove the truth or
It doesn't prove the truth, because what if I believe in the dragon at the bottom of the garden, or the spaghetti monster?
Leprechauns if you're Irish.
And it seems to be the case that really irrespective of which religion fills that place in your life, you still get the same boost in meaning post starting to believe.
Well, I'm not convinced of that, you see, because I'm sitting here as a Christian, and I've reason for being a Christian, because I don't find this need met in those practitioners of other religions. I don't find that sense of fulfillment and peace.
But when I look at the stats here, data shows that devout Muslims and a devout Hindu get the exact same psychological meaning boost and sense of peace as a devout Christian.
Well, how do you measure that?
Well, they ask them, is your life more meaningful? And sometimes I've got one particular friend who's part of his, evidence that what he believes is true is the feeling he got when he started believing it.
Yeah, well,
but the data suggests that
if it is true, a positive feeling would reinforce that, of course, but it doesn't prove it in the end. But then your criteria for yourself of what you accept will be different from that person. So you have to proceed on the basis like Thomas of old. He wouldn't accept what the other guys said. He said, I need the evidence for myself, and you need the evidence for yourself.
I guess
evidence of the kind that's going to give you a settled peace and confidence in what you believe. I can understand that perfectly.
Then there are also, I was thinking that there's fiction movies I've watched that made me feel really good
Yes, sure.
afterwards, and they made me feel like more motivated and connected to the universe.
Yes, of course.
So this is really telling, because the point that Bartlett raises here, it's data, and Lennox, the best that he has in response is to say, oh, well, I don't know if that data is real. Like, I don't know if I can trust that. So he just questions it because he doesn't have a sufficient response to it. So there's not really a helpful response that he provides, because it's a very legitimate issue to raise. It's a very legitimate fact to be presented that there is no difference in the outcome of one religion or another. So there it is. At the end of the day, I really hope that what Lennox is saying is true. I want it to be true. The problem is that Lennox is a mathematician. He's not a philosopher, and neither is Bartlett. And so the arguments being made here are not grounded in a rigorous philosophical foundation. And so there are lots of problems, as we've discussed, with what's being said here. It's not very helpful. I think the questions that were raised by Bartlett are very legitimate questions, and they stand. Lennox's responses really didn't even address them directly for the most part. They sidestepped a lot of them, and they were just sort of maybe cutesy sort of responses. So this doesn't really give us a great sense of why a person can believe in God's existence. I think that what Lennox does well is present a better version, a good version of what Christianity is, of what faith means, the core of the Christian faith, and why that is, let's say, valuable. However, if you want a sort of logical and philosophical, rigorous explanation for why somebody should believe what Christians believe, this isn't really that helpful. It's not good enough, and I think you should look elsewhere. Maybe to somebody like William Lane Craig would have some helpful things to say about this, at least more helpful. But ultimately, an atheist philosopher would have knockdown arguments for the things that Lennox is saying, and fortunately, that is what it is. So as far as this conversation goes, I think that we would need to delve into it a lot more. So onward from there.